I know forum member Parag Khanna, who's not on here, I believe today, he's argued very eloquently in the past that, we really think of Middle East as it's a British colonial construct in terms of the term. And I say this, fully cognizant that my job title has Middle East in it. But, we're talking the Middle East as in its sort of distance from Britain and compared to the Far East, when really we could think about it as West Asia and a central component of a multipolar world. And those GCC countries, obviously, while strategically important on themselves, they're relatively small in terms of population and individual GDP. And they could, be a much more influential force if they were integrated, in pursuit of shared interests. On the other hand, we have the very dynamic but fragmented region of ASEAN, representing over 650 million people, collectively, attracting more FDI every year than China and having a bigger GDP than India. And I think, with this in mind, there are very important synergies that could, form the basis for a very profitable and mutually beneficial relationship. We can drill more into this later, but just on the one hand, you have the Gulf states, resource rich, cash rich, water scarce, in urgent need of economic diversification. Then the other hand, you have this, fast growing region of ASEAN, millions of tech savvy consumers, creative, ambitious young people, as you mentioned yourself, Simon, but in urgent need of investment in job creating industries and development of hard and soft infrastructure, not so much in Singapore, obviously, but elsewhere. So I think there's opportunities in both directions in terms of business to meet the needs and the aspirations of both regions.
Yeah, so just explain a little bit to those who don't know about the ASEAN region itself, because obviously you've got countries on the one hand like Singapore, highly developed, significant world players, and then you've got Myanmar and Brunei, for example. And just talk us through the fact that it's not a political union, is it? It's not like the European Union, it's an economic union.
Exactly, yes. It's an economic union. I mean, the ASEAN Union is much older than the GCC, but it has struggled to integrate along those terms. As you're talking about a country of 10 countries with very different stages of development. So yes, Singapore, highly developed economy on the one hand, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos on the other. And you mentioned Brunei. I mean, Brunei in terms of income per capita is well off, but it's very small and undiversified. It's in many ways similar to the GCC countries. And then you have a lot of countries in between, like Philippines, Thailand, that has quite an advanced industrial base, but also fairly high poverty levels. So there's a real mix of countries, and at the same time, mix of cultures,
Indonesia
religions.
as well, of course.
Indonesia, of course, a G20 country, one of the world's largest economies by GDP, but also a very poor country in many ways with huge, significant infrastructure challenges. So there's a huge, broad range of countries here with a lot of attractive propositions. I'm normally based in the Philippines, very dynamic consumer market, has a big industry for business process outsourcing, for example, and a huge export of migrant workers as well to the Middle East, interestingly enough.
I want to come on to that in a moment. So
yeah, but there's nowhere near, the uniformity of what you would have in the GCC, which on the surface should be quite an easy block to integrate in some ways, just because of the shared, religion, culture, and kinship. But, that kinship can also manifest itself in familial ties, disputes like we saw in 2017, with Qatar being blockaded really by the other member states there. And it's really these rivalries that have prevented in some ways, closer integration in the GCC. Whereas in the ASEAN region, there's just a broad range of disparities that have prevented more integration, I think.
So therefore, if the ASEAN region is not a political unit, so to speak, or entity, I should say, is it purely through trade that the ASEAN region can be in dialogue with the Gulf region?
No, I mean, there are various ways that multilateral blocks like this could engage. But I think, really at the moment, because of the state of these unions, relationships have really been fostered on a country to country level. We can talk about this now or later, but at the moment, things have been pushed forward on a more bilateral basis by the sort of more globally oriented trading nations of these two regions. There's not really a sort of empowered decision-making body process in either the GCC or ASEAN to really bring about, meaningful dialogue at the moment, or relations, I would say, at the economic level. But that could be the case in future, especially, if you think about COVID-19 and how that has, in some ways exposed vulnerabilities of individual nation states or regions when it comes to, global supply chains. In the GCC, there's a lot of competition in terms of, at the one hand, you could understand the region of why this region could integrate and advance shared interests in economic policy, social policy, foreign policy, security policy. But on the other hand, we saw what happened recently in Saudi Arabia, where the government of Saudi Arabia has announced that it wants to incentivize multinational companies to set up the regional headquarters in Saudi Arabia if they want to bid for government contracts. Now, this would be an obvious challenge to the UAE and Dubai. But on the same hand, the GCC has seen vulnerabilities in things like food supplies, medicine supplies that have come with the pandemic. So there's obviously, opportunities here to better integrate industrial development to meet those shared regional challenges as well. But until that happens, I think we'll be seeing more of a country to country growth in ties between these two regions than a trade bloc to trade bloc growth in ties.
Okay, that's very interesting. I didn't know you were going to say that, or didn't expect you to say that, I should say, because what we're really talking about is trade bloc to trade bloc, but really you're saying that isn't really quite how it is. That's interesting. I mean, what are the most important trade and economic relationships that currently exist? And you alluded there to kind of post-pandemic or pandemic now, post-pandemic. How are they going to advance? How useful are some of the territories within the ASEAN region going to be to some of the territories within the Gulf region?
Sure. It's an interesting question, and sorry for maybe not going in the direction you expected, but I'm just being sort of realistic at the moment in terms of where we are. I think the most important relationships at the moment are those globally integrated trading nations. So on the one hand, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and on the other hand, Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand especially, and increasingly Indonesia. But without Indonesia, those 5 countries constitute around 75% of trade between these regions. At the moment, it's very much underpinned by trade in energy. ASEAN is a net importer of oil. Indonesia and Malaysia, aside from Brunei, Indonesia and Malaysia do have well-known reserves of oil and gas, but they are dwindling at the same time as domestic demand is rising. And most oil imports into ASEAN come from the GCC, particularly UAE and Saudi Arabia. I think LNG, liquefied natural gas, would be an area to watch. Particularly, we've seen various plans announced from the Philippines to Vietnam to even Myanmar for LNG import facilities to make up for dwindling domestic reserves and also meet that rising national demand. So you think this might open the door for countries like Qatar, with Qatar pushing ahead with its vast North Field expansion that should see it cement its position as the world's leading supplier of LNG. But at the same time, I wouldn't be so sure that all this LNG capacity that's been spoken about in ASEAN will really come on stream, given the financial and bureaucratic and pandemic-related delays really that have come up with some projects, plus the continued attraction of cheap coal in ASEAN. ASEAN has about 45% of its energy mix coming from coal, and that might even rise over the next 10 to 20 years, I would say, unfortunately. And that would, threaten the long-term transition or the pace of transition towards renewable energy, of which LNG could be an important part. But we also see downstream petroleum products being quite important. Kuwait has invested in a refinery in Vietnam. We have Saudi Aramco and Petronas developing the rapid refinery and petroleum project in Johor in Malaysia. And Singapore, in the other direction, has taken a big equity stake in ADNOC, in Abu Dhabi National Oil Company's oil pipeline infrastructure as well. So, there are shared investments there. So it's really underpinned at the moment by energy trade. But I would say, as the Gulf states try to accelerate the diversification ambitions, which they need to do, and as the ASEAN states try to move up the industrial value chain and expand the opportunities for the large and aspirational populations, then we are seeing, new opportunities open up in both directions.
Okay, so let's talk about the elephant in the room. Let's talk about China. So, whenever I'm in Singapore and the whole topic of ASEAN comes up, China always seems to be sitting next to any discussion about ASEAN. So I don't know enough about ASEAN to know whether ASEAN is largely created as a region in order to prosper, but equally to defend itself from initially Japan and now obviously China. But China, we know Belt and Road. We know it's invested heavily in both regions, in ASEAN, in the Gulf. What is the future relationship between the countries of the ASEAN region and the Gulf with the China influence? And I see Daniel Widdicombe's on the line here, so I might well bring you in, Daniel, on this one.
Sure. Do you want me to go first and then maybe bring some of the...
Yes, please.
Sure,
Yes,
sure.
please.
Yeah, I think Sam Olsen's here as well, so he might want to say a few
Sam
words.
is there, I can see him. Yeah, why don't we do that? Daniel, after Patrick's spoken, you come on, please, and then Samuel, please.
Well, if we talk about, as I did in the beginning, of really the Gulf and Southeast Asia being parts of Asia, West and Southeast, any discussion of interactions between the constituent parts of Asia, will in some ways, have to take into account Asia and Asia's biggest economy and the rapidly growing China. But China, I don't think, will dictate how these regions necessarily interact with each other. Taking case the Belt and Road Initiative, which you mentioned, of which many projects are taking place in the GCC, many projects are taking place in Southeast Asia as well. Over the long term, hopefully this will facilitate mutually beneficial trade between those regions as well. But that would happen, I think, independent of China, and it would be incremental over many years. China does obviously, I think, want a greater say in the architecture of global decision making, and it will seek to expand influence in both regions, in the Gulf and Southeast Asia, often in similar ways. We saw it with vaccine diplomacy recently, happening in the Gulf and Southeast Asia. I think, that has the intention and probably the impact of, fostering goodwill, but also bolstering China's reputation for innovation and securing long-term business, in this case in medical supplies, but in many ways, the Belt and Road is doing this in other areas as well, from rail infrastructure to digital infrastructure. And I think that's smart, and I don't think that necessarily has an impact on, I don't think it will shape too much how the Gulf and Southeast Asia interact with one another. I think China will seek influence in both regions in quite similar ways, but I think relations between the Gulf and Southeast Asia will develop on their own terms, albeit in a world in which China is an increasingly prominent power.
Excellent. Daniel, are you there? Your photo's not there, but
yes, I am. Sorry.
Yes, good. There you are.
Good afternoon, Patrick. Thank you very much for your comments. And I think I agree with you that China's dealings with the Gulf and ASEAN will go ahead in parallel. China has been criticized over the years for bullying the smaller nations of Southeast Asia. And even in recent years, their foreign ministers have railed at various countries, saying that they're small countries and that China won't listen to them. And that's happened in Cambodia and Vietnam in the last few years. And at the construct of ASEAN in some areas was seen to be as a counterweight to the size of China, even 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I can't remember when ASEAN was established, but I do remember living in Hong Kong in the 90s, that it was often seen as the only way to deal with China was to have the Southeast Asian nations grouped together. Of course, China is very adept at creating country-to-country relations and becoming a major trading partner with each of them, which means it makes it very difficult for ASEAN to rebut China if it wants to in any area. I wonder what you think about that. And also, I'm very interested in the Myanmar situation. I was also have friends there and it was out there a couple of years ago. China has a lot of skin in the game in infrastructure projects in Myanmar. Maybe Japan has bigger range of activities in retail and consumer businesses like auto and beverage and beer, so on and so forth. But I'd be very interested to hear your views on China and Myanmar in particular. Thank you.
Patrick.
Sure. No, I think it's an interesting point, and I think I spoke to Simon actually shortly after the crisis in Myanmar started, and I think I wasn't alone. You know, someone who considered myself, you know, quite abreast of what's happening there, was quite shocked. I didn't expect that to happen at all. I couldn't see what the military's end game was, and I've been watching closely to see how China have responded, because I don't think it's in China's long-term interest either to have the military junta in place for a long time. Because it's true, China has, you know, very strategic long-term interests in Myanmar, including, you know, access to the Bay of Bengal, and, you know, huge projects have been announced under the NLD government. So it's interesting to see how that will develop. You know, China wants to prioritize stable relations regardless of who is in charge, I suppose. But it's certainly an interesting dynamic to see. And I think one of the issues with the ASEAN sort of decision-making architecture is this emphasis on unanimity rather than a broader definition of consensus. So this is one of the issues you see. Find it very hard to sort of take action against member states like Myanmar when, you know, pretty terrible things are happening internally. And at the same time, you know, lots of the countries of ASEAN are not particularly democratic themselves. You know, we do see, you know, elections in the Philippines. I'm not saying that there's dictatorship in the Philippines, but obviously we have elections in Indonesia, and Indonesia is a very vibrant democracy, but then other countries in the region, much less so. So it's not unsurprising that the ASEAN sort of leaders are not taking action against Myanmar, but at the same time, you know, it's very easy for China to sort of coerce individual ASEAN members, especially perhaps the sort of less developed, weaker members like Cambodia, like Laos, and like Myanmar. And by doing so, you know, they present the ASEAN bloc for presenting a united front against regional geopolitical challenges, such as, you know, disputes with the Philippines in the South China Sea or Vietnam. So I think there's an issue here in the ASEAN identity. What does ASEAN want to be? Because it could represent, as I mentioned before, a very, you know, powerful and influential force, and also attractive market collectively to businesses around the world, given its size and its economic potential. But at the moment, I think there's a bit of an identity crisis within ASEAN itself that has persisted for a long time.
And Sam, can we bring you in here, please? Good to see you there.
Hello, thanks Simon, and thanks Patrick. I really enjoyed it, and especially listening to what you're just saying about Myanmar. I completely agree. We did a week before it all kicked off, we did a sort of symposium about what the future geopolitical threats were in Asia. Not a single person mentioned Myanmar. So just like, what the hell is that for all about? But one thing I just wanted to raise about, Simon, your point about the impact of China. One of the things that came out of the National Party conference in March was a little seen announcement by China that they were now willing and keen, in fact, to intervene in strategic choke points for energy, which was interpreted as being military intervention. And it comes hot on the heels of a $400 billion deal that China's just done with Iran, for Iran to provide China with 25 years worth of oil. And in return, the militaries will do a lot more combined training. And so what we're looking for is is China taking much more of a strategic interest in parts of the Middle East. And for me, the worry is that if China is going to be doing that, then America's already there. It will complicate any future clashes between the US and China. Also, the other thing to point out is that the ASEAN going into the GCC, I completely agree, it's going to be country to country. But Patrick, here's a question for you. Do you think it's in China's interest for them to control any of the GCC and ASEAN relationships, or do you think actually China doesn't really care?
I don't think it's in a sort of immediate strategic interest. I think it's a good question, but I would say that China wouldn't be a huge priority to do so. I think I could see benefits from having an influence over that, but I really think China will sort of also focus more on its strategic relationships on a country-to-country basis, whether that's with UAE or with Saudi Arabia or with countries like Indonesia, Philippines, and so on. Now, China's broader strategy when it comes to sort of regional interdependency, like the Belt and Road Initiative, like, you know, related initiatives such as the digital Silk Road, I think these will have the impact of fostering greater interdependency and cohesion within that broader Asia region, which would benefit China. But I don't think it will directly seek to influence, for example, how UAE interacts with the Philippines, for example. I'm not sure if that was the actual question, but I mean, that's the way I see it.
Yes, it was. Yeah, it was. And it sounds credible what you said. Yeah, definitely.
So good. So I'm delighted to see Andrew Dalton's here, who's a fairly recent member to Forum, but based in Abu Dhabi. And maybe Andrew, you could pose the final question to Patrick and bring us back to the Middle Eastern region.
Sure, absolutely. Well, hello, Patrick. Hello, Simon, everyone. Well, first of all, just a quick comment on Myanmar. For what it's worth, even though we sit in Abu Dhabi and we are notionally a sort of a GCC partly focused investor, we invest in emerging markets around the world, and in particular in Southeast Asia, and we have a couple of investments actually in Myanmar. So we were somewhat unfortunately surprised by the events as the rest of the world were earlier this year in Myanmar. That said, I think an interesting observation, we're invested in the largest fintech business in Myanmar, a payments company. And the reaction from the CEO founder once the immediate dust had settled, I think was very, very interesting from the perspective of, let's say, somebody on the ground and somebody that's very well connected with senior folks in both the former government and the military government and the central bank and so on and so forth. His basic view was, this is incredibly sad, this is incredibly depressing. No, none of us really thought this was going to happen, but it's just a repeat of everything that's happened before. There's a few months shock. There will be a few months of very, very ugly kind of resistance and adjustment. But sadly, the people of this country are used to this, and 6 to 12 months from now, it'll be back to business as usual. And I think that's very, very telling, very interesting, because his view was, and obviously it's in his best interest to kind of keep his international base of investors calm, but he was basically saying, look, there's a short-term impact to business. Obviously, the government switching off the internet doesn't help a fintech business very much. So revenue fell through the floor for a few months and continues to suffer. But ultimately, he said, look, it's just a change of folks at the top. Ultimately, the military will put some kind of transitional, meaningful transitional arrangement in place. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the fundamentals won't change. There is, exactly as Simon and the others, and Patrick was saying, there is a young, hungry population here. They are desperate for work. They're already a very mobile population. Folks from Myanmar work in huge numbers across Southeast Asia, and in fact, some in the Middle East. Has one of the largest volumes of remittances, I think inward remittances of any of the developing countries in the region. And ultimately, it remains a country of tremendous natural resource value and also of strategic importance. So the interest of China and others isn't going to change. So in the summary, his basic view was, look, for you guys as international investors investing into this region, yes, obviously this isn't great. It doesn't increase your confidence in the short term, but ultimately this isn't going to change where we're going to be in 5 years. And in the company in question, we're co-invested with the likes of IFC and so on and so forth, and that seems to be broadly the consensus around the table. So that was just the point I wanted to make on Myanmar. More broadly on kind of relations between, let's not say relations, to talk about trade and business between Southeast Asia and the Gulf. Again, I wouldn't claim to be particularly well positioned to talk about trade between other members of the GCC with Southeast Asia, but certainly from the UAE perspective, I think it's very fair to say that in the UAE, Southeast Asia, as one of 2 or 3 regions in the world, is seen as an absolute prime target for the UAE in terms of ticking all of the boxes of the major ambitions that the UAE has over the next 20, 30, 40 years, specifically around economic diversification away from hydrocarbons, specifically focusing on making the UAE a center for tech and making the UAE a center for financial services in the sort of emerging world, and specifically for making the UAE a place where business can be done east to east, as a kind of connection point for business, for trade to be done between east to east regions and countries, and also east to west, when you otherwise have the sort of the difficult China dynamic in the room. So we see a lot of validation in that regard from, I mean, Mubadala, the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund, has invested significant capital just in the past 12 months in some of the huge Southeast Asian unicorn tech companies like Grab and Gojek. They're a big backer of the Grab Nasdaq IPO that's due to happen shortly. But I'd also point out that it's not all one way. It's not just the UAE and similar countries in the GCC saying, right, look, there's a big population and there's growing economies. Let's go and get a piece of that. The trade is in two directions. I personally sit on the board of a Thai fintech, another fintech company, a Thai fintech company. It's a large, again, payments company in Thailand. And we're in the process as of now, and this is very much driven by the Thai management, not by the investors, of looking to expand into the GCC, not for reasons of chasing capital, petrodollars, but actually because they see the GCC as an exciting high growth region in terms of it having, yes, relatively small populations, but wealthy populations, very tech savvy young populations, and places and a market for geo-agnostic tech companies to really try to make hay in. So I think there is a real opportunity, and we will see a real increase in volume of trade, particularly in those industries like tech, where not having tremendous physical infrastructure is necessary in both places. I think we will see a real significant rise in the volume of that attempt to do business in both directions.
Okay, thank you very much. So Patrick, we're just gone over our time. So would you like to just come back very quickly on that and by way of conclusion on this talk as well, please? Thanks for that, Andrew.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting point, and I would agree. I spoke a little bit about energy trade before, but I think there's a lot more, other areas, including tech, where there are big opportunities developing in both directions. On the tech side, we mentioned the remittances, and I think on the fintech side, there's a lot of opportunities there as well to sort of bring down the cost of remittances to places like the Philippines. And I think another area is in sort of agri-tech and food tech, where there's sort of different problems in many ways. With one area that's lacking arable land and space, another that has a lot of arable land but not necessarily the productivity. I think both areas could sort of develop mutually beneficial synergies there. And I think the other area would be green finance as well, as a lot of Gulf countries push ahead with renewable projects and low carbon projects. You have Malaysia, that's a very big center for Islamic finance. You already have Maybank actually opening an overseas branch in Dubai, and I think there's good opportunities in both directions to develop in terms of Islamic green financing as well. So those were three areas as well that I thought are interesting to mention. And I think, even though at the GCC and ASEAN level, there's not too much going on at present, I think this is an area to watch in terms of two-way trade, as was just mentioned as well by the previous speaker.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Patrick. And for all of you who would like to know more about the region, that discussion, I know Patrick's very open to that. I'm really glad to have introduced him to everybody here in the membership. And thank you so much, Patrick. And we look forward to seeing you all soon. We'll let you go back to your rain-sodden tropical island, and we'll go and enjoy the sunshine here.